A man who chose isolation, a woman with nowhere to run, and a winter that would change everything. He found her beneath his sign, barefoot, trembling, desperate. For 5 years, Rowan Hale had kept the world at arm's length, buried in snow and silence. But when Maylene collapsed at his door, something inside him cracked wide open. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was looking for survival. And he was about to discover he'd been barely surviving himself. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's dive into a tale of fire, ice, and a love that refused to die. The mountain didn't forgive mistakes. Rowan Hale knew that better than most. 5 winters he'd spent in these peaks, and the cold had taught him everything he needed to know about survival. Keep your fire burning, check your traps before dawn, trust nothing but your own 2 hands, and never, ever let anyone get close. The cabin stood at the edge of the tree line, a rough-hewn structure of timber and stone that had weathered more storms than Rowan cared to count. Smoke curled from the chimney into the brittle November air, the only sign of life for miles. Below, the valley stretched out in endless white, a frozen wilderness that kept the world exactly where he wanted it, far away. He stepped out onto the porch, his breath fogging in the early morning light. The sky was the color of old steel, heavy with the promise of snow. His axe rested against the woodpile, its blade catching the pale sun. He'd split enough logs yesterday to last through the week, but idle hands bred restless thoughts, and Rowan had learned long ago to keep moving. The sound of his boots crunching through fresh powder was the only noise for miles. He made his way down the narrow path toward the main trail, barely more than a suggestion of dirt beneath the snow, where he'd posted his sign 3 years back. Cook wanted, remote mountain cabin, winter only, must be hardy. It was a formality more than anything. Nobody ever came. The sign had weathered to gray, the letters fading like old scars. Twice a year, Rowan made the 2-day trek down to Settler's Ridge to stock up on supplies. And twice a year, the locals asked if he'd found anyone foolish enough to take the job. He never had. Didn't matter. He preferred it that way. Cooking his own meals, mending his own clothes, talking to no one but the wind and the occasional elk that wandered too close to the cabin. It was a hard life, but it was his life. Clean, simple, safe. The sign came into view through the trees, crooked and half buried in a drift. And beneath it, crumpled in the snow like a broken bird, was a woman. Rowan stopped dead. For a moment, he thought she was already gone. Her body lay motionless, dark hair spilled across the white powder, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. She wore a thin cotton dress, in this cold, and no shoes. Her feet were bare, pale as ice, and streaked with blood. He didn't move. Couldn't. Because this wasn't real. It couldn't be. People didn't just appear out of nowhere in the middle of the mountains. Not dressed like that. Not alive. But then her fingers twitched. Rowan was beside her in 3 strides, dropping to his knees in the snow. Up close, he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, the blue tinge to her lips, the way her eyelids fluttered without opening. She was small, delicate even, with features he couldn't quite place. Asian, he thought. Chinese, maybe. Her skin was smooth and pale, her hair long and tangled with bits of frost. "Hey!" His voice came out rough, unused. He touched her shoulder, shook her gently. "Can you hear me?" No response. He glanced around, half expecting to see tracks, some sign of how she'd gotten here, but the snow was smooth in every direction except for the trail of her own stumbling footprints, leading back toward the valley. She'd walked here, barefoot, through miles of frozen wilderness. What the hell happened to you? Questions could wait. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, one under her knees, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp and cold as the snow itself. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the faint, erratic thump of her heartbeat through the layers of his coat. Still alive, barely. Rowan turned and started back toward the cabin, moving as quickly as the snow would allow. Her breath came in shallow gasps, barely visible in the freezing air. Hypothermia. Frostbite, probably. He'd seen it before. In trappers who stayed out too long, in miners who got caught in storms. The body shut down piece by piece, trying to protect what mattered most. If he didn't warm her up fast, she'd be dead by nightfall. The cabin door banged open under his shoulder and he carried her inside, kicking it shut behind him. The fire had burned low, just a bed of coals glowing in the hearth. He laid her on the floor in front of it, as close as he dared, and grabbed an armful of kindling from the box. Within minutes, flames were licking up through the logs, casting orange light across the room. Rowan pulled off his coat and spread it over her, then dragged a thick wool blanket from the bed and layered it on top. She didn't stir. Her lips were still blue, her breathing too shallow. Not enough. He hesitated, jaw tight, then started unlacing her dress. The fabric was damp, clinging to her skin like a second layer of ice. If he left it on, it would pull the heat right out of her. He worked quickly, trying not to think about the fact that he was undressing a stranger, a woman he'd found half dead in the snow. His hands were steady, clinical, the same way they were when he skinned a rabbit or dressed a wound. The dress came off, revealing a thin cotton shift beneath. He pulled that off too, then wrapped her in the blanket and his coat, tucking the edges tight around her. Her skin was cold to the touch, but not frozen. Not yet. He sat back on his heels, staring at her. "Who are you?" The question hung in the silence, unanswered. She didn't look like a settler, didn't look like anyone from Settlers Ridge or any of the mining camps farther east. The dress was simple but well made, the kind of thing a woman might wear in a town, not out here. And those feet, torn up and bleeding, like she'd walked through hell to get here, running from something or someone. Rowan's jaw tightened. He stood, crossed to the stove and filled a pot with water from the barrel by the door. While it heated, he pulled out the small tin of salve he kept for cuts and burns, then tore strips from an old shirt for bandages. When the water was warm, not hot, not yet, he soaked a cloth and knelt beside her again. He started with her feet, cleaning away the blood and dirt as gently as he could. The soles were shredded, raw and blistered, and he winced at the sight. She must have walked for miles, maybe longer. He worked the salve into the wounds, then wrapped them carefully, 1 foot at a time. Her hands were next. The fingertips were white, the nails cracked and dirty. He cleaned them, wrapped them, then checked her face and ears for frostbite. The tips of her ears were red, but not blackened. She'd gotten lucky. If you could call any of this lucky. By the time he finished, the fire was roaring, and the cabin had warmed to something almost comfortable. Rowan poured the rest of the water into a cup, let it cool, then lifted her head and tried to get her to drink. Most of it spilled down her chin, but a few drops made it past her lips. Her throat moved, swallowing weakly. Good enough. He set the cup aside and sat down on the floor beside her, back against the rough stone of the hearth. The heat from the fire soaked into his shoulders, but he barely felt it. His eyes stayed on her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the way the firelight played across her face. She was beautiful. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. He shoved it aside. Didn't matter what she looked like. What mattered was whether she'd live through the night. Hours passed. The fire crackled. Snow began to fall outside, soft and steady, piling up against the windows. Rowan didn't move. He watched her breathe, watched for any sign of change, and tried not to think about the last time he'd sat like this, waiting to see if someone would wake up. She didn't. By the time dusk fell, her breathing had evened out, deeper and more regular. Her lips had lost some of their blue tinge, and when he touched her forehead, her skin felt warmer. Not warm, but warmer. Progress. Rowan stood, stretched the stiffness from his back, and moved to the stove to heat up some stew. He ate standing, his eyes never leaving her. When he finished, he banked the fire, added another log, and settled into the chair by the hearth. He'd sleep here tonight, just in case. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Snow hissed against the glass. Inside, the cabin was warm, quiet, filled with the smell of wood smoke and the faint, lingering scent of something floral, her hair, maybe, or her skin. Rowan closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He listened to her breathe, and tried not to wonder what the hell he was going to do when she woke up. Morning came cold and gray. Rowan woke with a start, his neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. The fire had burned down to embers again, and the cabin was colder than he liked. He stood, added wood, and blew on the coals until flames caught. Then he turned. She was awake. Her eyes were open, dark and wide, staring up at the ceiling. She didn't move, Didn't speak, just lay there wrapped in blankets like she wasn't entirely sure where she was. Or maybe she knew exactly where she was, and that was worse. Rowan froze. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The fire crackled. Snow tapped against the window. Her gaze shifted slowly until it landed on him. He saw the fear in her eyes, saw the way her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket, the way her body tensed like she was deciding whether to run. "You're safe," he said quietly. His voice sounded too loud in the silence. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer, just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Rowan took a slow breath. "You were outside, in the snow. I brought you in. You were—" He gestured vaguely. "You were freezing. I had to warm you up." Still nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware of how rough he must look. 5 days since his last shave, hair too long, clothes that smelled like smoke and sweat. He probably looked like exactly the kind of man a woman should be afraid of. "Do you speak English?" he asked. A pause. Then, barely audible, "Yes." Her voice was soft, accented, cautious. Like she was testing the word to see if it would break. Relief washed through him. "Good. That's good." He moved to the stove, poured water into a cup, and brought it to her. "Here, you need to drink." She didn't take it, just looked at the cup, then at him, her eyes dark and wary. "I'm not going to drug you," he said, exasperated. "It's water. You've been out for almost a full day. You need to drink something." Slowly, she pushed herself up onto one elbow. The blanket slipped, and she grabbed it, pulling it tight around her shoulders. Her hair fell across her face, and she pushed it back with shaking fingers. When she reached for the cup, her hand trembled so badly that Rowan had to steady it, his fingers brushing hers. She flinched at the contact, but she drank. When the cup was empty, she handed it back without meeting his eyes. "Thank you. You're welcome." He set the cup aside, then crouched down so he wasn't looming over her. "What's your name?" A long silence. "Maylene," she said finally. "Maylene." He nodded. "I'm Rowan. Rowan Hale. This is my cabin." She looked around, taking in the rough walls, the low ceiling, the single room with its bed in one corner and the stove in the other. Her gaze lingered on the door, then the window, like she was calculating distances. "You're a long way from anywhere," Rowan said. "How did you get here?" Her jaw tightened. "I walked." "Barefoot?" "I had shoes." Her voice was flat. "I lost them." "Where did you come from?" She didn't answer. Rowan studied her. She was older than he'd thought at first, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Her face was pale and drawn, shadows beneath her eyes. But there was something in the set of her mouth, the way she held herself, that spoke of strength or stubbornness. Maybe both. "Maylene," he said carefully, "if someone's after you, no one is after me." The words came out sharp, defensive. Then, softer, "There is no one." He didn't believe that, but he also didn't push. Not yet. "All right," he said. He stood, crossed to the stove, and ladled stew into a bowl. "You need to eat." He brought it to her along with a spoon and set it on the floor within reach. She stared at it like she didn't know what to do. Then, slowly, she picked up the spoon and took a bite. Rowan watched her eat, his mind racing. She was here, in his cabin, a stranger, a woman, who'd literally stumbled out of nowhere and into his life. He should take her back down to Settler's Ridge, hand her over to someone who could figure out where she came from and where she needed to go. But something about the way she held that blanket, the way her eyes kept darting to the door, told him she wouldn't go willingly. And something about the way his chest had tightened when he'd found her in the snow told him he wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. She finished half the bowl before setting it down. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Leave?" Rowan frowned. "And go where?" "I don't know." "You can't even walk." She looked down at her bandaged feet, and for the first time, something like despair flickered across her face. "I will manage." "No," Rowan said flatly. "You won't." Her eyes snapped up to his, sharp and defiant. "You cannot keep me here." "I'm not keeping you anywhere, but you're not going back out in that storm." He gestured to the window, where snow was already piling up against the glass. "You'd be dead before you made it a mile." "That is not your concern." Like hell it isn't. The words came out harsher than he meant, and he forced himself to take a breath. Look, you want to leave? Fine, but not until you're strong enough to actually survive it. Give it a few days, let your feet heal. Then, if you still want to go, I'll take you down to the nearest town myself. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. A few days, she said. A few days, Rowan agreed. He turned away, busying himself with cleaning up the dishes, trying to ignore the strange knot in his chest. She was just passing through. Just another lost soul who'd wandered too far into the wild and needed a hand getting back out. That was all. But when he glanced over his shoulder and saw her sitting there in the firelight, wrapped in his blankets and staring into the flames, something inside him whispered that nothing about this woman was going to be simple. And he was right. The first day she barely moved. Rowan gave her the bed, insisted on it, despite her protests, and slept in the chair by the fire. She spent most of the time sleeping, or staring at the ceiling, or watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. He kept busy, checked his traps, split wood, kept the fire going. Normal things. Routine. Except nothing felt routine anymore. The cabin felt smaller with her in it. Every sound she made, the rustle of blankets, the soft intake of breath, the creak of the bed frame when she shifted, seemed to echo in the silence. Rowan found himself hyper-aware of her presence, of the way the light fell across her hair, the way her hands moved when she ate. He didn't like it. By the second day, she was sitting up, moving around a little. Her feet were still bandaged, but she could stand if she leaned on the wall. She didn't talk much. Rowan didn't push. He cooked, she ate, and they existed in a strange, fragile quiet that felt like it could shatter at any moment. On the third day, he found her at the stove. He'd gone out to check the traps at first light, and when he came back, the smell of something cooking hit him the moment he opened the door. He stopped, snow still clinging to his coat, and stared. Maylene stood at the stove, one hand braced against the counter for balance, the other stirring something in a pot. She'd wrapped a blanket around her shoulders like a shawl, and her hair was tied back in a loose knot. She looked up when he came in, her expression cautious. "I made soup," she said. Rowan blinked. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." He shrugged off his coat, hung it by the door, and crossed to the stove. The soup smelled incredible, nothing like the bland stew he'd been living on for months. He glanced into the pot and saw vegetables, herbs, something that might have been ginger. "Where did you get all this?" he asked. "Your supplies." She gestured to the shelves. "You have more than you use." That was true. He'd stocked up heavy before winter, and half of it was just sitting there, untouched. He'd never been much of a cook. Food was fuel, nothing more. But this smelled like something worth savoring. "Can I try it?" he asked. She nodded, and he ladled some into a bowl. The first spoonful hit his tongue, and he had to stop himself from groaning out loud. It was rich, savory, with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He could taste ginger, garlic, something earthy and faintly sweet. "This is good," he said. Maylene's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I am glad." They ate together, sitting at the small table by the window. The snow had stopped, and pale sunlight filtered through the glass, turning everything soft and white. Rowan watched her as she ate, the careful way she held the spoon, the way her eyes drifted to the window every few seconds. "You're a good cook," he said. "I was a cook," she corrected. "In San Francisco, before—" She stopped, her expression closing off. Rowan didn't push, but he filed the information away. San Francisco. That was weeks from here, maybe longer on foot. She'd come a hell of a long way. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Her hands stilled. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, then quietly, "I had to." "Because of someone?" "Because there was nothing left for me there." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "My husband died. His family did not want me, so I left." Rowan's chest tightened. He knew what it was like to lose someone. Knew what it was like to have the world turn cold and empty overnight. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't respond. Just set down her spoon and stared out the window, her face unreadable. The silence stretched. Then, finally, she spoke again. "The sign," she said. "The one in the snow. You are looking for a cook." Rowan frowned. Yeah, but I can cook. She turned to look at him, her eyes steady. I can clean, mend clothes, keep house. You need help. I need a place to stay. We can help each other. He stared at her. You want to stay here? For the winter. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. When spring comes, I will leave. But until then, I will work. I will earn my place. Maylene, please. The word hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Rowan saw the desperation in her eyes, the pride that kept her from begging even as she asked. She wasn't looking for charity. She was looking for a trade. Fair terms. He should say no. Should take her down to Settler's Ridge and let someone else deal with her. But the truth was, he could use the help. And the soup was damn good. And maybe, just maybe, he was tired of being alone. All right, he said, you can stay. For the winter. Relief washed across her face, so quick he almost missed it. Thank you. But you don't work until your feet heal, he added firmly. And when spring comes, if you want to leave, I'll take you wherever you need to go. Deal? Deal. They shook hands across the table, her fingers small and warm in his. And for the first time in 5 years, Rowan felt something like hope, even if he didn't quite trust it yet. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Maylene's feet healed slowly. For the first week, she couldn't do much beyond sitting by the fire, her bandaged feet propped on a stool Rowan had fashioned from an old crate. But she didn't stay idle. Her hands were always moving, mending his shirts, darning socks with thread she'd found in a tin under the bed, folding and refolding blankets until the creases were sharp as knife edges. Rowan watched her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice, the way her fingers moved with such precision, such purpose. Like she needed to prove her worth with every stitch. It bothered him more than it should have. You don't have to do that, he said one morning, nodding at the shirt in her lap. She'd been working on it for an hour, fixing a tear in the sleeve he'd been ignoring for months. I know, she said without looking up, but I want to. Maylene, you gave me a place to stay. I will not be useless. There was an edge to her voice, something defensive and fierce. Rowan recognized it. He'd heard the same tone in his own voice plenty of times, back when people had tried to help him after Sarah died, back when he'd wanted to prove he could survive alone. He let it go. By the second week, she was walking without wincing. The bandages came off, revealing pink, tender skin that would scar but had healed clean. She moved through this cabin like she was memorizing it, learning the location of every pot, every tool, every plank in the floor that creaked underfoot. And slowly, so slowly Rowan almost didn't notice, the cabin began to change. It started small. The dishes, which he usually left stacked by the basin until he ran out, were washed and put away each night. The floor, which he swept maybe once a week, was clean every morning. The blankets on the bed were tucked tight, the pillow fluffed, the whole thing looking less like a nest and more like something a person might actually want to sleep in. Then she started cooking, real cooking, not just soup, but meals that filled the cabin with smells he'd half forgotten existed. Rice with vegetables and strips of dried venison, seasoned with things he couldn't name. Bread, actual bread, crusty and warm, that she baked in the cast iron pot over the fire. Stews that tasted nothing like his bland utilitarian versions. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked one night, his bowl already empty and his stomach pleasantly full. Maylene shrugged, wiping down the counter. My mother taught me, and later in San Francisco I worked in a restaurant. You must have been good. I was. No false modesty, just fact. Rowan leaned back in his chair, studying her. She'd changed in the past 2 weeks. The hollowness in her cheeks had filled out a little. The shadows under her eyes had faded. She moved with more confidence now, less like a cornered animal and more like someone who'd decided she had a right to take up space. It suited her. Why did you stop? He asked. Her hand stilled on the counter. My husband became ill. I stayed home to care for him. And after he died, she trailed off, her jaw tight. His family owned the restaurant. They made it clear I was no longer welcome. Rowan felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden. That's a hell of a thing to do to someone. They did not see me as family. I was inconvenient. She said the word carefully, like it tasted bitter. So I left and came here. I did not plan to come here. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I only walked for days. I did not know where I was going. I just could not stay. Rowan understood that. He'd done the same thing after Sarah. Walked until the pain felt distant, until the world narrowed down to the next step, the next breath, until nothing mattered but survival. Well, he said quietly, I'm glad you ended up here. Maylene's eyes met his, dark and searching. For a moment, something passed between them. An understanding maybe, or just the recognition of two people who'd both been broken and were still trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. Then she looked away, and the moment dissolved. I will make tea, she said, and turned back to the stove. Rowan watched her move, efficient and graceful, and felt something shift in his chest. Something he didn't have a name for and wasn't sure he wanted to examine too closely. So he didn't. He just sat there, in the warmth of the cabin, and let himself feel almost content, for the first time in a very long time. The snow came heavier as November bled into December. Some mornings, Rowan had to dig his way out just to reach the woodpile. The drifts piled higher against the cabin walls, turning the world into a study in white and gray. The sky stayed low and heavy, the kind of oppressive ceiling that made the mountains feel even more isolated than usual. But inside the cabin, something was shifting. It was in the small things. The way Maylene started humming while she worked, soft melodies in a language Rowan didn't understand. The way she'd set his coffee by his chair in the morning without him asking, the cup always hot, always perfect. The way she laughed, just once, brief and surprised, when he told her about the time a raccoon had broken into his supplies and eaten an entire bag of cornmeal. He found himself talking more. Not a lot, but more than he had in years. About the mountains, the animals, the rhythms of the seasons. She listened, asked questions, seemed genuinely interested. And sometimes when the fire burned low and the night pressed close, she'd share pieces of her own story. Her childhood in a village he couldn't pronounce. The journey to San Francisco with her father, who died a year after they arrived. Meeting her husband. A kind man, she said, though her voice always went distant when she spoke of him. The restaurant, the customers. The satisfaction of feeding people and watching them smile. I miss it, she admitted one night. Not the restaurant, just the cooking. Making something with my hands and knowing it brought someone joy. You do that here, Rowan said. She glanced at him, surprised. I do? Yeah. He gestured at the remnants of their dinner, roasted rabbit with herbs, root vegetables glazed in something sweet and savory. This is the best food I've had in 5 years. Maybe longer. A faint smile touched her lips. You are easy to please. Maybe, but I mean it. You're good at this, Maylene, really good. Her smile widened, just a little, and something warm bloomed in Rowan's chest. They were sitting closer these days. It had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Where before they'd kept a careful distance, her by the stove, him by the fire, now they shared the table, their chairs angled toward each other. Sometimes their knees would brush under the table, or their hands would collide reaching for the same thing, and they'd both pull back quickly, murmuring apologies. But the touches lingered in Rowan's mind longer than they should have. He started noticing things he hadn't before. The way her hair caught the firelight, turning it auburn and gold. The curve of her neck when she tilted her head. The small scar above her left eyebrow, pale and thin. The way her eyes softened when she looked at him, like she was seeing something in him he didn't know was there. It unsettled him. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was here for the winter, nothing more. A temporary arrangement. Come spring, she'd leave, and his life would go back to the way it was before. Quiet. Safe. Alone. But the thought of that, of the cabin empty again, of silence instead of humming, of eating bland stew and sleeping in an unmade bed, made his chest feel tight in a way he didn't like. One afternoon, he came back from checking the traps to find her standing at the window, staring out at the snow. She didn't turn when he came in, just kept watching the world beyond the glass, her expression distant. You all right? He asked, shaking snow from his coat. Yes. But her voice said otherwise. Rowan hung up his coat and crossed to stand beside her. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly, white and still. Beautiful, if you had the stomach for it. Deadly, if you didn't. "You ever regret coming here?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "No, not here. But I regret other things." "Like what?" "Staying too long, not leaving sooner, letting people make me feel small." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I thought if I was useful enough, quiet enough, good enough, they would accept me. But I was never going to be enough for them. I see that now." Rowan's jaw tightened. He didn't know the people who'd hurt her, but he hated them anyway. Hated anyone who could look at someone like Maylene, strong, capable, kind, and decide she wasn't worth keeping. "You're enough," he said. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "You are," he said again, the words coming out rougher than he meant. "Whatever they made you feel, they were wrong. You hear me?" Her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes suspiciously bright. Rowan reached out, slowly, carefully, and touched her shoulder, just a brief, grounding pressure. "You're safe here. I won't make you feel small." "I know," she whispered. They stood there, side by side, the silence between them no longer awkward but something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to understanding. Then Maylene stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned toward the stove. "I should start dinner," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Yeah." Rowan cleared his throat. "I'll, bring in more wood." He escaped outside into the biting cold and tried to ignore the way his heart was pounding. This was getting complicated, and he didn't know what the hell to do about it. December deepened, and with it came the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made the snow squeak underfoot. Rowan kept the fire roaring day and night, but even then the edges of the cabin felt frigid. Frost crept along the windows, turning them opaque. The wind howled through the peaks, a constant, mournful sound. But inside, the warmth held. Maylene started sitting closer to the fire in the evenings, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Rowan would settle into his chair, and they'd talk, or not talk, just exist together in the flickering light. Sometimes she'd mend clothes. Sometimes he'd sharpen knives or oil his traps. Comfortable, easy tasks that didn't require much thought. One night, she asked him about the sign. "Why did you post it?" she said, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "If you wanted to be alone, why ask for help?" Rowan stared into the fire, considering. "I didn't think anyone would actually come. The sign was more insurance, in case I got hurt or sick or couldn't manage on my own. A way to tell myself I had options, even if I never used them." "But you do not like people." "I didn't say that." "You live alone in the mountains. That says it for you." He huffed a laugh, surprised. "Fair point." Maylene smiled just a little. "So why do you really stay here, Rowan?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Rowan's hand stilled on the whetstone, the knife half sharpened in his lap. "I had a wife," he said finally. The words felt like pulling teeth. "Sarah. We lived in Settler's Ridge, had a little house, plans for a family. Then she got sick. Fever, the doctor said. Nothing he could do." Maylene's needle stopped moving. "She died in the spring," Rowan continued, his voice flat. "And after that, I couldn't stay. Everything reminded me of her, every street, every face. So I came up here. Figured if I was going to be miserable, I might as well be miserable somewhere I didn't have to pretend I was fine." "And are you?" Maylene asked softly. "Fine." Rowan looked at her. Her face was open, sympathetic, but not pitying, just understanding. "I was getting there," he said, "before you showed up. And now?" Now he didn't know. Now the cabin didn't feel like a refuge from the world. It felt like the world itself, small and warm and full of possibility. Now he woke up looking forward to coffee and conversation instead of dreading another day of silence. Now he couldn't imagine her not being here. "Now," he said carefully, "I think maybe I was just surviving, not really living." Maylene's eyes softened. "I understand that." "Yeah," Rowan said. "I figured you might." They held each other's gaze, the firelight dancing between them. Something unspoken passed through the air, a current neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Then Maylene looked down, back to her mending, and the moment broke. But it didn't disappear. It lingered, humming beneath the surface, waiting. 2 days before Christmas, not that either of them celebrated, Rowan made a decision. He needed supplies, salt, flour, a few other things they were running low on. Normally, he'd wait until spring to make the trek down to Settler's Ridge, but the winter had been mild enough that the trails were still passable. If he left early, he could make it there and back in 3 days, but that meant leaving Malin alone. "I'll be fine," she said when he brought it up. "I know how to keep the fire going, and I will not wander off." "It's not that." Rowan frowned, pacing the cabin. "If something happens, if the weather turns, or an animal gets too close, then I will deal with it." Her voice was calm, steady. "I am not helpless, Rowan." He knew that, but the thought of leaving her here, vulnerable and alone, made his stomach twist. 3 days, he said finally. "I'll be back in 3 days. You stay inside, keep the door barred, and don't take any chances, understand?" "I understand." He didn't believe her, but he also didn't have a choice. The next morning he packed light, just enough supplies for the journey and a list of what he needed to buy. Maylene handed him a bundle of food wrapped in cloth, enough to last the trip. "Be careful," she said. "Always am." She stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and watched him shoulder his pack. For a moment, Rowan hesitated, wanted to say something, though he didn't know what. Instead, he just nodded. 3 days. 3 days, she echoed. And then he was walking away, down the trail and into the trees, the cabin growing smaller behind him. He didn't look back, but he thought about her the entire way down the mountain. Settler's Ridge was exactly as he remembered, small, rough, populated by trappers and miners, and the kind of people who didn't ask too many questions. Rowan kept his head down, bought his supplies quickly, and tried to ignore the stares. "Been a while, Hale," the shopkeeper said, tallying up his order. "Thought maybe the mountain had swallowed you." "Not yet." "You still up there alone?" Rowan hesitated. Technically, the answer was no, but he didn't owe anyone an explanation. "Yeah." The shopkeeper shrugged and wrapped his purchases. "Suit yourself? Though I don't know how you stand it, I'd go crazy with nobody to talk to." Rowan paid and left without responding. He spent the night in the boarding house, a drafty room with a lumpy mattress that felt nothing like the bed in his cabin. He slept poorly, dreams filled with snow and fire, and dark eyes watching him from across a table. By dawn, he was already packed and heading back up the trail. The weather held. The trek back was uneventful, the kind of mindless trudge that left too much room for thinking. Rowan's thoughts kept circling back to the cabin, to Maylene, to the way she'd stood in the doorway and told him to be careful, like she cared whether he came back. The realization settled in his chest, warm and uncomfortable. He reached the cabin just before dusk on the 3rd day, exactly as promised. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the window. Relief washed through him, sharper than he'd expected. She was all right. He pushed open the door and the smell hit him immediately. Something savory and rich, layered with spices. Maylene looked up from the stove, her face brightening. "You are back." "Told you I would be." He set down his pack, shrugging out of his coat. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, quiet. Boring, even." She turned back to the pot, stirring. "I made dinner. You must be hungry." He was. But more than that, he was glad to be here. Glad to see her. Glad the cabin felt warm and lived in instead of cold and empty. Glad she'd stayed. They ate together, and Rowan told her about the trip, the supplies, the shopkeeper, the lousy bed at the boarding house. She listened, asked questions, laughed when he described the old miner who'd tried to sell him a lucky rabbit's foot for an outrageous price. It felt normal, easy, like coming home. After dinner, they settled by the fire, the silence comfortable. Maylene pulled out her mending, and Rowan leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension of the past 3 days drain away. "I miss this," he said without thinking. She looked up, surprised. "Missed what?" "This." He gestured vaguely. "Talking, not being alone." Maylene's expression softened. "I missed it too." Their eyes met, and Rowan felt that pull again, stronger this time, undeniable. The space between them felt charged, electric, like the air before a storm. He should look away, should say something to break the tension, but he didn't, and neither did she. The fire crackled, snow whispered against the windows. And in the warm, quiet heart of the cabin, something unspoken began to take root, something that would change everything. The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, until Maylene looked away first. She bent her head over her mending, her fingers moving with deliberate precision, but Rowan could see the faint flush creeping up her neck. He cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "I should check the traps before it gets full dark." "Now?" She glanced toward the window where dusk was already deepening into night. "It is nearly dark already." "Won't take long." He was out the door before she could respond, pulling it shut behind him with more force than necessary. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and clarifying. He stood on the porch, breathing hard, watching his breath fog in the frigid air. What the hell was he doing? She was leaving in the spring. She'd said so herself. This was temporary. A business arrangement. She cooked and cleaned, he provided shelter. Simple, clean, safe. Except nothing about the way he felt when he looked at her was simple. Rowan scrubbed a hand over his face and forced himself down the porch steps. The traps didn't need checking, he'd reset them that morning, but he needed distance. Needed to clear his head and remember why he'd come up here in the first place. To be alone. To not feel anything. To survive without the risk of losing someone again. But Maylene had walked into his life barefoot and broken. And somehow, without him even noticing, she'd started putting him back together too. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. When he came back an hour later, frozen and no closer to clarity, Maylene was already in bed. The fire had been banked, the cabin tidied, and she lay with her back to the room, the blankets pulled up to her shoulders. Rowan told himself he was relieved, told himself this was better. But when he settled into his chair and closed his eyes, all he could see was the way she'd looked at him across the fire. Like he mattered. Like he was more than just a man who'd given her shelter. And that terrified him more than the cold ever could. The next week passed in careful politeness. They spoke when necessary, shared meals, went about their routines. But the easy comfort that had been building between them was gone, replaced by something stiff and awkward. Maylene didn't hum while she worked anymore. Rowan spent more time outside than he needed to. They were avoiding each other without leaving the same room. It couldn't last. On the 8th day, Rowan came in from splitting wood to find Maylene standing at the table, staring down at something in her hands. She didn't look up when he entered, just kept turning the object over and over. A small carved bird, no bigger than her palm. He'd made it years ago, back when whittling had been something to do with his hands during the long winter nights. He'd forgotten it was even there, tucked away in a drawer with other bits of half-finished work. "Where did you find that?" he asked. She startled, nearly dropping it. "I was looking for thread. I did not mean to pry." "You weren't prying. It's fine." He hung up his coat and crossed to the stove, pouring himself coffee from the pot she always kept warm. "You can have it, if you want." "You made this?" "Yeah, a long time ago." Maylene ran her thumb over the smooth wood, tracing the delicate curve of the wing. "It is beautiful." Rowan shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. "It's just a bird." "No." She looked up at him, her eyes serious. "It is more than that. You gave it detail, personality. You cared about making it right." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her. She set the bird down carefully, like it might break. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Pretend you do not care about things. You do. I see it. In the way you built this cabin, the way you keep it, the way you—" She stopped, her jaw tightening. "You are not as cold as you pretend to be." Rowan's hand tightened around the cup. "You don't know me, Maylene." "I know enough." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I know you found a stranger dying in the snow and brought her into your home. I know you gave up your bed and slept in a chair for weeks. I know you look at me like I matter, even though you are trying very hard not to." The air left his lungs. "Maylene, why did you pull away?" she asked, and the hurt in her voice cut through him like a blade. "After you came back from town. You have been distant. Did I do something wrong?" "No." The word came out too fast, too desperate. "No, you didn't do anything wrong." Then what? He set down the coffee cup, his hand shaking slightly. This was it. The moment he could either tell her the truth or lie and keep himself safe, and he was so damn tired of being safe. I pulled away, he said slowly, because I'm scared. She blinked. Of what? Of this. He gestured between them, helpless. Of you. Of the way I feel when you're around. Of what happens when spring comes and you leave. Maylene's eyes widened. Rowan, I lost someone I loved, he continued, the words spilling out now, unstoppable. And it nearly killed me. So I came up here and I built walls, and I told myself I'd never let anyone get close again. And then you showed up and you... He broke off, shaking his head. You made me want things I thought I was done wanting. The silence that followed was deafening. Maylene stood frozen, her hand still resting on the carved bird, her expression unreadable. Then quietly she said, What do you want, Rowan? Everything. The word burned on his tongue, but he couldn't say it, couldn't let himself be that vulnerable. But Maylene took a step toward him and then another until she was close enough that he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breath, the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. I am scared too, she whispered, of wanting something I cannot keep, of being left again, of not being enough. You are enough, Rowan said fiercely. You're more than enough. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. Truth, maybe, or certainty. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her because she reached up and placed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. Then stop running from me, she said. Rowan covered her hand with his own, holding it there. He could feel his heart pounding against their joined hands, could feel the warmth of her seeping into him. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to let someone in without being terrified they'll leave. I do not know either. Her voice was soft, honest. But maybe we can learn together. He looked down at her. This woman who'd walked through hell to get here, who'd survived loss and cruelty and kept her strength, and felt something inside him shift, not break, but open, like a door he'd locked tight, finally swinging wide. Yeah, he said, maybe we can. And then slowly, carefully, he bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative. Her lips were soft and warm, and she made a small sound of surprise that turned into something softer, sweeter. Rowan cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and kissed her like she was something precious, something worth holding on to. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Maylene's eyes were bright and her cheeks flushed. I have wanted you to do that for weeks, she confessed. Rowan huffed a laugh, breathless. Yeah? Yes. She smiled, small and genuine. I thought I was imagining it, the way you looked at me sometimes. You weren't imagining it. He rested his forehead against hers, still holding her face. I've wanted this. Wanted you. I was just too stubborn to admit it. You are still stubborn, she teased. Yeah, well, you're stuck with me now. Her smile widened. Good. They stood there, wrapped up in each other, the fire crackling softly behind them. And for the first time since Sarah died, Rowan felt like he could breathe without it hurting. The shift between them was immediate and undeniable. The awkwardness dissolved, replaced by something warmer, something that hummed beneath every glance and touch. Rowan found excuses to be near her, brushing past her at the stove, reaching around her for a pot, letting his hand linger on the small of her back when he passed. Maylene responded in kind, her fingers trailing across his shoulder when she set down his coffee, her body angling toward his when they sat by the fire. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Because now that he'd let her in, Rowan couldn't imagine closing that door again. 3 days later, he decided it was time. I need to go into town, he said over breakfast. Get a few things. And I was thinking, maybe you could come with me. Maylene looked up, surprise flickering across her face. To Settler's Ridge? Yeah, it's not much, but you've been cooped up here for weeks. Might do you good to see some different faces. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. I do not know if that is a good idea. Why not? People will ask questions about who I am, why I am with you. Let them ask. Rowan reached across the table and took her hand. You're not hiding anymore, Maylene, and I'm not ashamed of you being here. Her eyes softened. You are certain? I'm certain. They left the next morning, the trail down the mountain easier now that Rowan had walked it recently. Maylin bundled herself in layers, one of his old coats over her dress, a scarf wrapped around her head. But she still shivered in the cold. Rowan kept close, steadying her when the path grew steep, his hand a constant presence at her elbow. It took most of the day to reach Settler's Ridge. By the time they arrived, the sun was low, and the town was settling into evening. Rowan led her straight to the boarding house, paid for a room, and told her to rest while he handled the errands. I will come with you, Maylin said. You don't have to. I want to. So they walked through town together, side by side, and Rowan felt every pair of eyes that turned their way. The stares were sharp, curious, some outright hostile. He heard the whispers as they passed, saw the way people leaned together, murmuring. Maylin kept her head high, her expression calm, but Rowan could feel the tension in her body. At the general store, the shopkeeper's wife gave them a long, appraising look. Who's this then? Maylin, Rowan said flatly. She's staying with me for the winter. Staying with you? The woman's tone was loaded with implication. That's so. It is. The woman sniffed and turned her attention to Maylin, looking her up and down like she was inspecting livestock. You're Chinese. I am, Maylin said quietly. Long way from home, aren't you? This is my home now. The words hit Rowan square in the chest. He glanced at Maylin, saw the set of her jaw, the defiance in her eyes, and felt something fierce and protective surge through him. We need flour, salt, and coffee, he said, cutting off whatever the shopkeeper's wife had been about to say. And make it quick. We've got a long walk back. The woman huffed, but moved to gather the supplies. While she worked, Rowan felt Maylin's hand slip into his. He squeezed gently, a silent reassurance, and didn't let go. Outside, as they loaded the supplies into his pack, a man approached. Tall, grizzled, with a face like old leather and eyes that missed nothing. Rowan recognized him, Jack Sutherland, one of the miners who worked a claim up in the eastern hills. Hail, Sutherland said, nodding. Jack! The man's gaze slid to Maylin, assessing. This the woman folks are talking about? Didn't realize we were worth talking about. Everything's worth talking about in a town this small. Sutherland's mouth twitched, might have been a smile. She your woman? Rowan's jaw tightened. He should have expected this. Should have known that bringing Maylin here would invite exactly this kind of scrutiny, but hearing the question out loud, blunt and intrusive, made his blood heat. She's with me, he said evenly. That's all you need to know. Sutherland chuckled, low and rough. Fair enough. Just be careful, Hale. Not everyone in this town is as open-minded as me. Noted. The man tipped his hat to Maylin and walked off. Rowan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Are you all right? Maylin asked softly. I should be asking you that. She managed a small smile. I have dealt with worse. That doesn't make it right. No, she agreed, but it is what it is. People will think what they want. I stopped trying to change their minds a long time ago. Rowan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she shouldn't have to accept cruelty just because it was common, but he also knew she was right. The world was what it was. All they could do was decide how they'd move through it, together or alone. He chose together. Come on, he said, shouldering the pack. Let's get something to eat before we head back. They ate at the tavern, a dim, smoky place that smelled of grease and old beer. The food was mediocre at best, but it was hot, and after weeks of eating only what they could make in the cabin, even bad tavern stew tasted like a luxury. Rowan watched Maylin eat, saw the way she held herself, spine straight, movements precise, like she was determined not to take up more space than absolutely necessary. It made him angry all over again, thinking of all the ways the world had taught her to make herself small. When we get back, he said, I want you to teach me. She looked up, confused. Teach you what? To cook? The way you do? With the spices and the flavors. I want to learn. Maylin blinked, clearly surprised. Why? Because it's something you're good at, something you care about, and I want to understand it. He hesitated, then added, I want to understand you. Her expression softened, something warm and tender blooming in her eyes. I would like that. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and by the time they stepped back out into the cold, the sun had set completely. The streets were dark, lit only by the occasional lamp in a window. Rowan led her back to the boarding house, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Inside their room, small, sparse, with a narrow bed and a single chair, Maylene sat on the edge of the mattress and unwound her scarf. Rowan set down the pack and lit the lamp, casting the room in a warm golden glow. "Thank you," Maylene said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing me here, for standing beside me." Rowan crossed to her, crouching down so they were eye level. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I do." She reached out, her hand cupping his jaw. "Most men would not have. Most men would have been embarrassed, ashamed. Then most men are idiots." She smiled, soft and genuine, and leaned forward to kiss him. It was slow, tender, a question and an answer all at once. Rowan kissed her back, his hands settling on her waist, and felt the last of the walls he'd built crumble into dust. When they finally pulled apart, Maylin's eyes were dark, her breathing uneven. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. "Do not sleep in the chair." Rowan's heart pounded. "Maylene, I do not want to be alone, and I do not think you do either." She was right. He didn't. He was tired of being alone, tired of keeping her at arm's length, when all he wanted was to pull her close and never let go. "All right," he said. They undressed carefully, modestly, and slipped beneath the blankets. The bed was narrow, forcing them close, but neither complained. Rowan wrapped his arms around her, and Maylene tucked herself against his chest, her head resting over his heart. "This feels right," she murmured. "Yeah," Rowan agreed, his voice rough. "It does." And for the first time in 5 years, he fell asleep holding someone he cared about, and didn't dream of loss. The storm rolled in 2 days after they returned to the cabin. Rowan had seen it coming, the way the sky turned heavy and bruised, the way the wind picked up and carried the sharp metallic scent of snow. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to read the signs. This wasn't going to be a light dusting, this was going to be a blizzard. "We need to stock up," he said, already pulling on his coat. "Bring in extra wood, check the shutters, make sure everything's sealed tight." Maylene nodded and moved to help, but Rowan stopped her. "You stay inside, keep the fire going. I'll handle the outside." "I can help." "Maylene." He caught her hand, squeezed gently. "Please, I need to know you're safe and warm in here. Let me do this." She hesitated, then nodded. "Be quick." He was. He worked fast, hauling wood until the pile inside was stacked to the rafters, checking the shutters and the roof for weak spots, filling every container they had with fresh snow to melt for water. By the time he finished, the wind was howling and the first flakes were starting to fall, thick, heavy, relentless. Rowan barred the door behind him and turned to find Maylene standing by the fire, her face tight with worry. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad. We'll be stuck inside for a few days at least." She nodded, accepting it. "Then I will make sure we do not starve." The storm hit with a vengeance. Within hours, the world outside was a wall of white, the wind screaming through the peaks loud enough to rattle the shutters. Snow piled against the cabin, burying the windows, turning day into a dim, eerie twilight. Inside it was warm, safe. Rowan kept the fire roaring and Maylene cooked, filling the cabin with smells that made his mouth water. They ate together, sitting close, and tried to ignore the fury raging outside. But as night fell and the storm intensified, the weight of their isolation settled over them. They were alone. Completely, utterly alone. No one knew they were here. No one could reach them if something went wrong. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like freedom. Rowan sat in his chair watching Maylene move around the cabin and felt something inside him settle. This was what he'd been missing. Not just companionship, but partnership. Someone to weather the storms with. Someone who made the silence feel full instead of empty. Maylene caught him staring and smiled. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm glad you're here." She crossed to him, settling onto his lap without hesitation. Rowan's arms came around her automatically, holding her close. "I am glad too," she said softly. "Even with the storm." "Especially with the storm," she laughed, the sound bright and warm. You like being trapped? I like being trapped with you. Her smile faded, replaced by something deeper, more intense. Rowan? He knew what she was asking, knew what she wanted, and for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't afraid to give it. I'm falling for you, he said quietly. Hell, maybe I already have. I don't know. But I know that when I look at you, I don't see someone who's leaving in the spring. I see someone I want to keep. Maylene's breath hitched. You mean that? Every word. She kissed him then, hard and desperate, like she'd been holding back and couldn't anymore. Rowan kissed her back with equal intensity, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. The storm raged outside, but inside they created their own heat, their own wildness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maylene pressed her forehead to his. I do not want to leave in the spring, she whispered. I want to stay. With you. Rowan's heart felt too big for his chest. Then stay. You mean it? I mean it. She kissed him again, softer this time, sweeter. And Rowan held her tight, anchoring them both against the storm and the world and everything that had tried to break them. They had survived, both of them, and now, together, they were learning how to live again. The blizzard lasted 3 days and 2 nights, burying the world in white silence. But inside the cabin, time moved differently, slower, warmer, filled with discoveries that had nothing to do with the storm raging beyond the walls. Rowan learned the way Maylene hummed when she was concentrating, a melody without words that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. He learned that she was ticklish just below her ribs, that she laughed with her whole body when something truly amused her, that she slept curled on her side with one hand tucked beneath her cheek like a child. And Maylene learned him in return. The scar on his shoulder from a hunting accident years back, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, really smiled, not the half-hearted versions he'd been giving the world for so long. The rumble of his voice in the early morning, rough with sleep and surprisingly tender when he whispered her name. They talked through the long hours, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept locked away. Rowan told her about Sarah, really told her, not just the facts, but the feelings. The way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, the plans they'd made for a family, the crushing guilt he'd carried for not being able to save her. You cannot save someone from an illness, Maylene said gently, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest as they lay together in the firelight. You can only love them while they are here. I know that now. Took me a long time to accept it. Or grief is not something you accept, she said. It is something you learn to carry. He turned his head to look at her. Is that what you did? With your husband? Maylene was quiet for a moment, her hand stilling. Wei was a good man, kind. He worked too hard, cared too much about making his family proud. When he got sick, he made me promise not to mourn too long. He said I deserved to live, not just survive. Sounds like he knew you well. He did. Her voice was soft, wistful. But I think he would be happy that I found you. He always said I needed someone stubborn enough to keep up with me. Rowan huffed a laugh. I'm definitely stubborn. Yes, and infuriating sometimes. Only sometimes? She smiled and kissed his shoulder. Most times. Good thing you're stuck with me then. Good thing, she echoed, and the contentment in her voice made his chest ache in the best possible way. On the second night of the storm, Maylene taught him to make dumplings. She showed him how to mix the dough, how to roll it thin, how to fold the filling inside with quick, practiced movements that made it look easy. His first attempts were clumsy, the dumplings lopsided and leaking, but she didn't criticize, just guided his hands with hers, patient and encouraging. Like this, she murmured, her fingers covering his. Gentle but firm. You must be confident. Confident with dumplings. Got it. She laughed, warm and close, and Rowan realized he'd never been happier than he was right now, standing at a rough wooden counter with flour on his hands and this woman pressed against his back, teaching him something that mattered to her. When they finally ate, the dumplings were uneven, and some were definitely better than others, but they tasted like collaboration, like partnership, like home. Not bad, Maylene said, examining one of his creations critically. For a first attempt. High praise from a professional. Do not let it go to your head. He grinned and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. Wouldn't dream of it. The storm began to ease on the third day, the wind dying down to a whisper, the snow finally stopping. When Rowan opened the door, he had to dig through a drift that came up to his waist. The world beyond was transformed, everything buried, everything clean and white and new. He stood on the porch, breathing in the cold, clear air, and felt Maylene come up behind him. She slipped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. "Beautiful," she said. "Yeah." But he wasn't looking at the snow. The days that followed were some of the best Rowan could remember. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together, existing together, learning the shape of each other's lives. Maylene continued to cook, experimenting with what they had, turning simple ingredients into meals that tasted like love made tangible. Rowan taught her to split wood, to check the traps, to read the sky for signs of changing weather. And at night, they came together in the warmth of the cabin, in the bed they now shared without hesitation, and discovered that desire could be tender as well as fierce. That intimacy could heal as well as consume. But even in the midst of their happiness, Rowan knew the world beyond the cabin still existed, and eventually they'd have to face it. The reminder came on a cold morning in late January when Jack Sutherland appeared at their door. Rowan heard the knock and immediately went on alert. Nobody came up here in winter. Nobody except... He opened the door to find Sutherland standing there, covered in snow, his face grim. "Jack, what are you doing here?" "Need to talk to you, Hale. It's important." Rowan glanced back at Maylene, who'd risen from the table, her expression wary. He nodded to Sutherland and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" Sutherland shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Look, I don't like being the one to tell you this, but I figured you should know. There's talk in town. About you and the Chinese woman." Rowan's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The ugly kind. Some folks think it's not right, you living up here with her. Unmarried. They're saying you're taking advantage, that maybe she's not here by choice." Anger flared hot and fast in Rowan's chest. "That's bullshit and you know it." "I know it, but they don't. And there's a few who are making noise about coming up here to check on her, make sure she's all right." "She's fine. Better than fine." "I believe you, but they won't. Not unless..." Sutherland hesitated, then forged ahead. "Not unless you make it official. Marry her. Give them a reason to back off." Rowan stared at him. "You're saying I should marry Maylene to shut people up?" "I'm saying if you care about her, and I think you do, you need to protect her. And the best way to do that is to make sure nobody can question her place here." The words hit Rowan like a punch, because Sutherland was right. As long as Maylene was just some woman living with him, she'd be vulnerable. To gossip, to judgment, to people who might decide they had a right to interfere. But as his wife, legally, publicly, she'd have protections. Standing, a claim nobody could dispute. "When are they planning to come?" Rowan asked. "I'd say you've got maybe a week, 2 if the weather turns bad again." Rowan nodded, his mind already racing. "Thanks for the warning. Just do right by her, Hale. She seems like good people." "She is." Sutherland clapped him on the shoulder and headed back down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Rowan stood there for a long moment, staring out at the white expanse of mountains, trying to organize his thoughts. He wanted to marry Maylene, had wanted it, he realized, since the night of the storm when she'd told him she wanted to stay. But he'd been waiting for the right time, the right moment, some sign that it wasn't too fast or too reckless. Turned out the right time was now, before the world tried to take her away from him. He went back inside, and Maylene looked up immediately, concern etched on her face. "What did he want?" Rowan crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "There's talk in town. About us. Some people are... concerned." "Concerned?" Her voice was flat. "You mean they think I am your whore?" "Maylene, it is fine. I expected it." She tried to pull her hands away, but he held on. "It's not fine. And I'm not going to let them treat you like that." "What can you do? People will think what they want." "I can marry you." The words hung in the air between them. Maylene's eyes went wide, her lips parting in shock. "What?" "Marry me," Rowan said again, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I know it's fast. I know we've only been together a couple months, but Maylene, I don't want you to be vulnerable. I don't want anyone to have the power to take you away from me or make you feel like you don't belong here. And I sure as hell don't want to wait months or years to make you my wife when I already know that's what I want. Maylene stared at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You want to marry me to protect me? I want to marry you because I love you. The confession came out raw, honest. The protection is just a bonus. You love me? Yeah, I do. I love the way you hum when you cook, the way you make this cabin feel like home, the way you're strong even when the world tries to break you. I love that you stayed, and I love that you made me want to stop hiding. He squeezed her hands gently. So yeah, I love you. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. I love you too. So much I did not think it was possible to feel this way again. Is that a yes? Yes. She laughed through her tears. Yes, I will marry you. Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and felt something settle deep in his chest. This was right. This was what he'd been missing all those years alone on the mountain. Not just survival, but something worth living for. They were married a week later in Settler's Ridge, in a brief ceremony performed by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through. Rowan bought Maylene a simple gold band from the general store, and she wore the best dress she'd been able to make from fabric he'd purchased months ago, never thinking he'd see it on his bride. Jack Sutherland stood as witness, along with the shopkeeper's wife, who seemed slightly less hostile now that they were making things official. The whole affair took less than 10 minutes, but when the judge pronounced them married and Rowan kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, it felt like the most important moment of his life. Afterward, they celebrated with a meal at the tavern. Nothing fancy, but Maylene's eyes shone and her smile was radiant, and that was all Rowan needed. Mrs. Hale, he said, testing out the name. She laughed. It sounds strange. Good strange or bad strange? Good strange. She laced her fingers through his. I like it. They stayed in town that night, and Rowan made love to his wife with a tenderness that made her cry happy tears. And when she fell asleep in his arms, he stayed awake for a long time, just watching her breathe, marveling at the fact that this was his life now. He'd found love again. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something new, something that honored the past while building toward a future he'd never thought he'd have. The trip back to the cabin took most of the next day, but neither of them minded. They walked slowly, talking and laughing, stealing kisses when the trail widened enough to walk side by side. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was falling and the temperature was dropping fast. Rowan built up the fire while Maylene unpacked their things, and then they settled in together, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. I was thinking, Maylene said after a while. About what? The sign, the one that says you need a cook. What about it? We should take it down. Rowan looked down at her. Why? She smiled up at him. Because you do not need a cook anymore. You have a wife. His throat tightened with emotion. Yeah, I do. And maybe, she continued, her voice soft and a little shy, maybe someday we will need a bigger cabin for a family. Rowan's heart stuttered. A family? If you want that, I know we have not talked about it, and if it is too soon, he silenced her with a kiss, deep and thorough. When he pulled back, he was grinning. I want that. All of it. With you. Maylene's smile was brilliant. Then we will have it. They stayed up late that night, making plans and dreaming out loud. About expanding the cabin, about raising children in these mountains, about building a life that was wholly theirs. And when they finally went to bed, it was with the knowledge that they'd survived their separate winters and found each other on the other side. The next few weeks were a study in quiet happiness. Rowan and Maylene settled into married life with an ease that felt almost startling. They worked together during the day, checking traps, hauling wood, mending gear, and came together at night with a passion that never seemed to fade. But as February crept toward March, small changes began to appear in Maylene. She was tired more often, needing to rest in the afternoons. Her appetite shifted, certain smells making her nauseated. And one morning, she barely made it outside before she was sick in the snow. Rowan held her hair back, worry knotting his gut. Should I get the doctor? No. She wiped her mouth, her face pale but her eyes bright. I do not need a doctor. Maylene, you're sick. I am not sick. She turned to look at him, and slowly, a smile spread across her face. I am pregnant. The world stopped. Rowan stared at her, his mind struggling to catch up with the words. Pregnant? Yes, I am almost certain. The signs are all there. How? When? He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. Maylene laughed, the sound joyful despite her obvious discomfort. How do you think? And probably that first week after the storm, if I had to guess. Rowan's hand went to her stomach, flat and unchanged beneath the layers of clothing. Their child, growing inside her. A life they'd created together. Are you happy? Maylene asked, suddenly uncertain. Happy didn't begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as gently as if she were made of glass. I'm terrified and thrilled, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but yeah, I'm happy. She clung to him, laughing and crying at the same time. Me too, all of those things. They stood there in the snow, holding each other, and Rowan felt the last piece of his broken heart slot back into place. This was his family now, his wife, his child, his future. And he would protect it with everything he had. As the weeks passed and Maylene's pregnancy became more evident, Rowan found himself consumed with preparations. He started work on expanding the cabin, adding a small room that could serve as a nursery. He hunted more, preserving meat and stocking up supplies. He even carved a cradle from pine, working on it in the evenings while Maylene sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric. They were building something, not just a nursery, but a life. A legacy. And Rowan, who'd spent 5 years convinced he'd never want anything again, found himself wanting it all. One evening in late March, as the first hints of spring began to touch the mountains, Maylene sat by the fire with her sewing and said, Tell me about Sarah. Rowan looked up from the cradle, surprised. What about her? Everything. I want to know about the woman you loved before me. He set down his tools, considering. They'd talked about Sarah before, but never in detail, never the full story. She was good, he said finally, kind, patient with me even when I was being stubborn. She wanted a big family, at least 5 kids. Used to joke that she'd need that many to keep me in line. Maylene smiled. She sounds wonderful. She was, but she's gone, and I spent so long holding on to her memory that I almost missed you. He crossed to Maylene kneeling beside her chair. I'll always love her, always carry her with me. But you're my future now, you and our baby. Maylene's eyes glistened. You do not have to choose between us, you know. Love is not a finite thing. I know. Took me a while to learn that, but I know it now. She cupped his face, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. Then let us honor her memory by building something beautiful, something that would make her happy for you. Rowan kissed her palm. Yeah, let's do that. As spring truly arrived and the snow began to melt, revealing the green beneath, Rowan found himself thinking about the future more than the past, about the child who would be born in the fall, about teaching them to read the mountains, to respect the wild, to find strength in silence and beauty in simplicity, about raising them with Maylene, watching her be a mother, growing old together in this place they'd claimed as their own. He'd come to the mountains to hide from life, but life had found him anyway, barefoot and freezing in the snow, and had given him a second chance, and this time he wasn't going to waste it. One afternoon in early April, Rowan came back from checking the traps to find Maylene standing outside, her hand shading her eyes as she looked down the trail. What is it? He asked, immediately on alert. Someone is coming. Rowan's hand went to the rifle he always kept near the door. How many? Just one, I think. They waited, tense, as the figure drew closer. But as it came into view, Rowan relaxed. It was Jack Sutherland, huffing and red-faced from the climb. Jack, Rowan called, what brings you up here? Sutherland waved, catching his breath as he approached. Wanted to check on you both. Make sure everything's all right. We're fine, better than fine. Rowan glanced at Maylene, who nodded permission. Maylene's expecting. Sutherland's face broke into a genuine smile. Well, I'll be damned. Congratulations. Thank you, Maylene said warmly. Would you like to come in? I was just making lunch. Don't mind if I do. Over a meal of stew and fresh bread, Sutherland filled them in on the news from town. Most of it was mundane, who'd struck it rich, who'd gone bust, the latest gossip. But then he said something that made Rowan sit up straight. There's been talk of building a school in Settlers Ridge. Real proper school, with a teacher and everything. Rowan glanced at Malin, saw the interest spark in her eyes. That's so. Yep. Problem is we can't find a teacher. Most folks who have the education don't want to come out to the middle of nowhere, but I was thinking... He looked at Maylene. You speak English, Chinese, probably read and write better than most. Ever think about teaching? Maylin's eyes widened. Me? Why not? We need someone. And from what Rowan's told me, you're smart as a whip. Kids could do worse. She looked at Rowan, uncertainty written across her face. I do not know. You don't have to decide now, Sutherland said quickly. Just think about it. The pay wouldn't be much, but it'd be something. And it might be nice to have a reason to come down the mountain every now and then. Meet people. Be part of the community. After Sutherland left, Maylene was quiet, thoughtful. Rowan watched her, waiting. What are you thinking? He asked finally. That it is a generous offer, but also that I do not know if I want to leave our home so often, especially with the baby coming. It doesn't have to be right away, and it doesn't have to be full-time, but Maylene, he took her hand. You have so much to offer. If you want to do this, I'll support you. We'll figure it out together. She squeezed his hand, her expression softening. Let me think about it. Take all the time you need. That night, as they lay in bed with Maylene's head on his chest and his hand on her growing belly, she said, I think I would like to try. Teaching, not right away, but maybe in a year or two, when the baby is older. Yeah? Yes. I want our child to see that their mother is more than just a wife and cook, that she has value beyond the home. Rowan pressed a kiss to her hair. They'll see that no matter what you do, but I think you'd make a hell of a teacher. You are biased. Damn right I am. She laughed, warm and content, and Rowan felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. This woman, his wife, the mother of his child, had walked into his life broken and desperate, and somehow they'd healed each other, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to build something new from the pieces. And as the last of winter melted into spring and the mountains came alive with the promise of renewal, Rowan Hale finally understood what it meant to be whole again. They sat in the snow and watched everything burn. The cabin collapsed in on itself with a groan of timber and stone, sending embers spiraling into the twilight sky. Maylene shivered against Rowan's chest, her breathing still rough but steadier now. He'd wrapped his coat around her, pulled her as close as he could, but it wasn't enough. The temperature was dropping fast, and they had nothing, no shelter, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on their backs and each other. I'm sorry, Maylene whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke. I tried to put it out. I tried. Don't. Rowan tightened his arms around her. Don't apologize. You're alive. That's all that matters. But everything can be replaced. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. You can't. She turned her face into his chest, and he felt her tears soak through his shirt. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be all right, but the truth was, he didn't know if it would be. The cabin was gone. Their food, their tools, everything they'd need to survive the winter. And night was coming fast. Rowan's mind raced, cataloging their options. The nearest shelter was Settlers Ridge, 2 days away on a good trail. In the snow, with Maylene still weak from smoke inhalation, it would take longer. 3 days? Maybe 4. And they had no food, no water except what they could melt from snow, no way to make fire. They wouldn't make it. Unless... Can you walk? He asked. Maylene pulled back, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. I think so. Why? There's a trapper's shelter about 3 miles east. Old Jack Sutherland used to use it before he moved his operation closer to town. It's rough, but it'll have walls and a roof. Maybe some supplies if we're lucky. 3 miles. She tested her weight on her feet, swaying slightly. Rowan steadied her. I can make it. You're sure? I have to be. He couldn't argue with that. He helped her to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist. The sun was already touching the peaks, painting the snow gold and pink. They had maybe an hour of light left. Not enough to reach the shelter, but enough to get them partway there. "Stay close to me," Rowan said. "Step where I step. If you need to rest, tell me." Maylene nodded, and they started walking. The first mile was brutal. The snow was deep and the trail non-existent, forcing Rowan to break a path with every step. Maylene followed in his wake, stumbling occasionally but refusing to slow down. He could hear her labored breathing, the small gasps of pain she tried to hide, but she didn't complain, just kept moving, one foot in front of the other. When full darkness fell, they stopped. Rowan found a spot beneath a massive pine where the snow was shallower, sheltered by the thick canopy of branches. He cleared a space, packed down the snow, and pulled Maylene down beside him. "We'll rest here until first light," he said. "Try to sleep." "I'm not tired." Her teeth were chattering, her whole body shaking. Rowan wrapped himself around her, sharing what little warmth he had. "Yes, you are. Close your eyes." She did, though he doubted she'd actually sleep. He didn't expect to either. The cold was vicious, seeping through their clothes and into their bones. Every breath felt like inhaling glass. But they had each other, and somehow that made it bearable. Hours passed. The night deepened. Rowan drifted in and out of a half-conscious state, jerking awake every time Maylene shivered too hard or made a sound. He'd check her pulse, make sure she was still breathing, then pull her closer and try to will warmth into her body through sheer force of determination. At some point, she started talking. "My mother used to tell me stories," she murmured, her voice distant, "about phoenixes. Birds that die in fire and are reborn from the ashes." "That's a good story." "I always thought it was just a story, but now—" She pressed her hand over his heart. "Now I think maybe it is true. Not the bird, but the idea that we can be destroyed and still rise again." Rowan's throat tightened. "Yeah, maybe. I was destroyed, Rowan. When my husband died, when his family cast me out, I thought I had nothing left. No purpose, no future, just ash." Her fingers curled into his shirt. "But then I found you, and you made me remember what it feels like to want to live." "Maylene, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "If we die out here tonight, I want you to know that I do not regret any of it. Not coming here, not staying, not loving you. You gave me something I thought I would never have again. You gave me hope." Rowan pulled her tighter, his eyes burning. "We're not dying, you hear me? We're going to make it to that shelter, and then we're going to make it to town, and then we're going to figure out what comes next, together." "Promise?" "I promise." She nodded against his chest, and gradually her breathing evened out. She slept, finally, her body going lax in his arms. Rowan stayed awake, watching the stars wheel overhead through the gaps in the branches, and prayed, to whatever might be listening, even if he wasn't sure anything was, that he could keep that promise. Dawn came cold and gray. Rowan woke to find frost coating Maylene's hair, turning it white. Panic spiked through him until he felt her breathe, felt her heart beating steady beneath his hand. She was alive, still alive. He shook her gently. "Maylene, time to move." She stirred, groaning. "So cold." "I know, but we have to keep going." They struggled to their feet, joints stiff and muscles protesting. Rowan took a moment to get his bearings, then pointed east. 2 more miles, maybe less." Maylene nodded, and they started walking again. This time was harder. Maylene's steps were slower, more labored. She leaned heavily on Rowan, and twice she stumbled and nearly fell. But she didn't ask to stop. Just kept moving, her face set with grim determination. The sun climbed higher, offering light but no warmth. Rowan's fingers had gone numb hours ago. His face felt frozen, and he couldn't feel his feet. But he kept walking, kept scanning the landscape for the shelter, kept one arm locked around Maylene's waist. When he finally saw it, a rough structure of logs and sod tucked into the side of a hill, relief nearly brought him to his knees. "There," he croaked. "There it is." Maylene lifted her head, squinting. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Come on." "Almost there." The last 100 yards felt like 100 miles. But they made it. Rowan shouldered open the door, half frozen on its hinges, and pulled Maylene inside. The shelter was tiny, barely big enough for two people to lie down, but it was dry, and the walls cut the wind, and there was a small stone fireplace in one corner. Rowan lowered Maylene to the floor, then immediately started searching. He found a stack of old firewood, brittle and dry, a box of matches, miraculously still good, a wool blanket, moth-eaten but intact, and in the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, a small cache of supplies, jerky, hardtack, a tin of coffee. "Thank you, Jack," Rowan muttered, and set to work building a fire. His hands shook so badly he dropped the first 3 matches. But the fourth caught, and he nursed the tiny flame until it caught the kindling, then the larger logs. Within minutes, heat began to fill the small space. Rowan turned to find Maylene watching him, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes alert. "You did it," she said. "We did it." He pulled the blanket around her shoulders, then opened the tin of coffee. "Let me get some water melted. You need a drink." While the snow melted in a battered pot over the fire, Rowan sat beside her, rubbing warmth back into her hands. They were so cold, the skin almost blue. He chafed them between his palms, breathing on them, willing the blood to flow again. "I thought we were going to die," Maylene said softly. "I know. I did too for a while. But you kept going, kept us going. You did the same for me." He met her eyes. "You could have given up back there. I wouldn't have blamed you, but you didn't. I had a reason not to." She touched his face, her fingers still cold but warming. "You." Rowan kissed her palm, then pulled her into his arms. They sat like that, wrapped together in the firelight, as the water heated and the shelter warmed and the worst of the danger passed. They stayed in the shelter for 2 days, letting Maylene recover her strength and waiting for the weather to clear. Rowan rationed their meager supplies carefully, making the jerky and hardtack last, boiling snow for water, keeping the fire fed. It was a strange kind of limbo, safe for now, but acutely aware of how precarious their situation remained. On the 3rd morning, Rowan made a decision. "We're going to Settlers Ridge today," he said. "You're strong enough now, and we can't wait any longer. We're almost out of wood." Maylene nodded. "What will we do when we get there?" It was the question Rowan had been turning over in his mind for 2 days. The cabin was gone. Everything they'd built, everything they'd planned. He could rebuild, eventually. But that would take time, and winter wasn't over. They needed shelter, food, a plan. And more than that, they needed to decide if this was still the life they wanted. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out, together." "Together," she echoed, and took his hand. The walk to Settlers Ridge took them all day. They moved slowly, conserving energy, stopping frequently to rest. But the weather held, and by late afternoon the town came into view through the trees. Rowan felt a complicated mix of relief and dread. They'd made it. They were safe. But now they had to face whatever came next. They went straight to the boarding house, and Rowan paid for a room with the last of his money. The landlady gave them both a long look, taking in their smoke-stained clothes, their haggard faces, but didn't ask questions, just handed over a key and pointed them upstairs. The room was small and cold, but it had a bed and a stove, and after 3 days in the wild, it felt like luxury. Maylene collapsed onto the mattress, and Rowan built up the fire, then sat beside her. "Rest," he said. "I'm going to go talk to some people, see what our options are. Rowan, I'll be back soon, I promise." He left before she could argue, making his way through the muddy streets to the general store. The shopkeeper looked up when he entered, recognition flickering across his face. "Hail! Heard you had some trouble up on the mountain." Word traveled fast in a small town. The cabin burned down. Lost everything. The shopkeeper winced. "That's rough. What are you going to do?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Rowan leaned against the counter. "I need work. Something to get us through the winter. And I need credit for supplies. I'll pay it back in the spring." The shopkeeper sucked his teeth, considering. "You're good for it, I know. But work? That's trickier. Most of the mines are shut down for winter. Logging camps, too. There has to be something." "There might be." The shopkeeper drummed his fingers on the counter. "Old Widow Hutchins has been looking for someone to handle repairs on her property. Roof needs patching, fence needs mending, that kind of thing. Doesn't pay much, but it's something. I'll take it. And there's another thing. The shopkeeper's expression turned cautious. Jack Sutherland's been talking about expanding his operation come spring. He'll need men he can trust. Might be worth asking him if he'd hire you on. Rowan nodded slowly. It wasn't what he'd wanted, working for someone else, staying in town instead of the mountains. But it was a start. A way forward. Thanks, he said. I'll talk to both of them. He left the store and made his way to Widow Hutchins' house, a tidy cottage on the edge of town. The old woman answered his knock, peering up at him through thick spectacles. Mrs. Hutchins, my name's Rowan Hale. I heard you might need some help with repairs. She looked him up and down, her gaze sharp despite her age. You any good with a hammer? Good enough. Can you start tomorrow? Yes, ma'am. Then the job's yours, $1 a day, and I'll feed you lunch. It was less than he'd hoped, but more than he had. I'll take it. Thank you. She nodded briskly. Don't be late. From there he went to find Jack Sutherland. The old miner was at the tavern, nursing a whiskey and talking with a group of other weathered men. When Rowan approached, Jack looked up and gestured to an empty chair. Hale? Heard about your cabin. Hell of a thing. Yeah. Rowan sat, accepting the drink Jack pushed toward him. I need work, Jack. The shopkeeper said you might be hiring in the spring. I might be. Jack studied him. But that's months away. What are you going to do in the meantime? I picked up some repair work with Widow Hutchins, but I'll need more if I'm going to rebuild. Rebuild? Jack raised an eyebrow. You planning on going back up there? Rowan hesitated. Was he? The cabin was gone. The life he'd built, the isolation, the solitude, felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone he wasn't anymore. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe? Or maybe I'll build something different. Jack nodded slowly. Tell you what, you work for Widow Hutchins, prove you're reliable, and come spring, I'll hire you on. Fair wage, steady work. And in the meantime, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. Consider this a loan. Pay me back when you can. Rowan stared at the money, his throat tight. Jack, I can't. You can, and you will. You're a good man, Hale. And that woman of yours, she's good people too, I can tell. You deserve a chance to get back on your feet. Rowan took the money, his hands shaking slightly. Thank you. Don't mention it. Just don't make me regret it. I won't. When Rowan returned to the boarding house, he found Maylene awake, sitting by the window and staring out at the street. She turned when he entered, her expression anxious. What did you find out? She asked. Rowan sat beside her and told her everything, the repair work, Jack's offer, the loan. When he finished, Maylene was quiet for a long moment. So we will stay here, she said finally, in Settler's Ridge. For now. At least through the winter. After that, he took her hand. After that, we decide together. If you want to go back to the mountain, we'll rebuild. If you want to stay here, we'll make that work. Or if you want to go somewhere else entirely, we'll do that. What do you want, Rowan? I want to be with you. Everything else is just details. Maylene's eyes filled with tears. I want to stay, not in the mountains, here, where there are people and shops and possibility. I want to build something new, something ours. Rowan pulled her close, relief washing through him. Then that's what we'll do. She kissed him, soft and sweet, and he tasted salt from her tears. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. We are phoenixes, she said, rising from the ashes. Yeah, Rowan agreed. I guess we are. The next morning, Rowan started work at Widow Hutchins' house. The old woman turned out to be demanding but fair, with a sharp eye for shoddy workmanship and no patience for excuses. Rowan patched her roof, mended her fences, fixed the loose boards on her porch. It was hard work, but honest. And at the end of each day, he came back to the boarding house tired but satisfied. Maylene, meanwhile, started looking for work of her own. She approached the tavern owner about cooking, but he already had someone. She tried the boarding house, but the landlady did her own cooking. She was starting to lose hope when opportunity found her in an unexpected place. Rowan came back one evening to find her sitting at the small table in their room, a piece of paper spread out in front of her and a pencil in her hand. What's this? He asked. An idea. She looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. There is no Chinese restaurant in this town. No place that serves the kind of food I know how to make. So I thought, what if I started one? Rowan blinked. A restaurant? A small one, nothing fancy, just good food, fair prices. Mus. She gestured to the paper which was covered in notes and numbers. I have been asking around. There is a small building near the edge of town. Used to be a seamstress shop. The owner is willing to rent it cheap. And with the money Jack loaned us, plus what you are earning, you really think this could work? I do, but only if you think so too. Rowan looked at the paper, at the careful calculations, and the hopeful gleam in her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. This was it. This was the new life they'd been talking about. Not a replica of the old one, but something entirely different, something they'd build together from nothing. Let's do it, he said. Maylene's smile could have lit up the entire town. The next 2 months were a blur of activity. Rowan worked for Widow Hutchins during the day, then spent his evenings helping Maylene prepare the restaurant. They scrubbed the building top to bottom, patched holes in the walls, built tables and benches from salvaged lumber. Maylene painted a sign, simple and elegant, that read Maylene's Kitchen in both English and Chinese characters. The townspeople watched with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some muttered that it would never work, that nobody would eat foreign food. Others were cautiously interested, drawn by the smells that started drifting from the kitchen as Maylene tested recipes. On opening day, Rowan stood beside Maylene in the doorway, both of them nervous and hopeful. They'd done everything they could. Now all they could do was wait and see if anyone would come. For the first hour, nobody did. Then Widow Hutchins walked through the door, followed by Jack Sutherland. Then the shopkeeper and his wife. Then a few miners, curious and hungry. By noon, every table was full and the air was thick with the smell of ginger, garlic, and soy sauce. Rowan watched Maylene move through the crowd, serving food and answering questions, her face flushed with pride and joy. She was radiant, alive, exactly where she was meant to be. And when she caught his eye across the room and smiled, Rowan felt his heart swell with a love so fierce it almost hurt. They'd lost everything, the cabin, their supplies, the life they'd planned. But they'd gained something far more valuable. They'd gained each other, and a future they were building together, one meal at a time. That night, after the last customer left and the kitchen was clean, Rowan pulled the small ring box from his pocket. He'd been carrying it with him since the fire, keeping it safe, waiting for the right moment. This felt like the right moment. Maylene, he said. She turned from where she was wiping down the counter, her expression curious. Yes? Rowan crossed to her, took her hand, and dropped to one knee. Her eyes went wide. Rowan, I know I already asked you once, and you already said yes, but I wanted to do this properly. He opened the box, revealing the delicate gold band. Maylene, you walked into my life when I'd given up on everything. You showed me that surviving isn't the same as living. That home isn't a place, it's a person. You're my person, my home. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice when you chose me. Tears streamed down her face. You do not have to prove anything. I want to anyway. He slipped the ring onto her finger. Will you marry me? Yes, she whispered. Yes. Always yes. He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with everything he had. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands fisted in his shirt, her body pressed against his like she couldn't get close enough. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maylene looked down at the ring on her finger, turning it so it caught the lamplight. It is beautiful, she said. Not as beautiful as you. She laughed, bright and genuine, and Rowan felt something inside him settle. This was it. This was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of pain or struggle, but the presence of someone who made it all worthwhile. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the boarding house, with Widow Hutchins and Jack Sutherland as witnesses. Maylene wore a simple dress she'd made herself, and Rowan wore his best shirt. There were no flowers, no fancy decorations, just two people promising to love each other through whatever came next. And when the landlady declared them married and Rowan kissed his wife for the first time, he felt like the luckiest man alive. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in fits and starts. But when it finally arrived in earnest, it brought warmth and green and the promise of new beginnings. Maylene's restaurant thrived. Word spread beyond Settlers Ridge, and travelers started making detours just to eat her food. She hired help, a young woman named Clara, who wanted to learn to cook, and began expanding the menu. Rowan took the job with Jack Sutherland, working the claims and learning the business. The pay was good and the work was honest. And every evening, he came home, not to a lonely cabin in the mountains, but to a small house they'd rented on the edge of town, where his wife waited with dinner and a smile. They talked sometimes about going back to the mountain, about rebuilding the cabin, reclaiming that life. But the conversations were always wistful, nostalgic, because the truth was, they'd outgrown that version of themselves. They didn't need isolation anymore. They needed community, connection. The messy, complicated, beautiful reality of being part of something larger than themselves. One evening in late May, Rowan came home to find Maylene standing in the kitchen, her hand pressed to her stomach, her expression dazed and wondering. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing is wrong." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I am pregnant." Rowan's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard he thought it might burst. "You're sure?" "I am sure." He crossed to her in 3 strides, swept her into his arms, and spun her around. She laughed, clinging to him, and when he set her down, he kissed her with everything he had. "We're going to have a baby," he said, awed. "We are. A family." "Yes." She cupped his face. "Our family." Rowan thought about Sarah then, briefly, about the family they'd wanted but never got to have. And he felt a pang of sadness, but also something like peace, because that was a different life, a different version of himself. He would always carry Sarah's memory, would always love what they'd had. But this, Maylene, the baby, the life they were building, this was his future, and it was more than he'd ever dared to hope for. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." They stood there in their small kitchen, holding each other, as the sun set outside and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. And Rowan thought about how far they'd both come, from broken and lost to whole and found, from surviving to living, from cold to warmth, from ashes to flame. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Rowan stood on the porch of their house and looked out at the town. Maylene was inside nursing their daughter, a tiny, perfect thing they'd named Sarah Lynn, honoring both their pasts. The restaurant was closed for the day, giving them time to be a family. Behind him, the mountains rose against the sky, snow already dusting their peaks. Rowan thought about the cabin up there, long since reclaimed by the wilderness, about the man he'd been when he'd lived there, hollow, hurting, half alive. That man was gone now, burned away in the same fire that had consumed the cabin, and in his place was someone new, someone who'd learned that love was worth the risk, that home wasn't about walls and roofs, but about the people you chose to let in. Someone who'd found his way back to life because a barefoot woman had stumbled into his world and refused to let him stay lost. Maylene called his name from inside, and Rowan turned away from the mountains, turned toward warmth, toward family, toward the future they were building together. He'd chosen the cold once, thinking it would protect him from pain, but he'd been wrong, because the only thing that could truly heal a frozen heart was fire. And Maylene, his wife, his partner, his flame, had burned away the ice and taught him how to feel again, how to love again, how to live again. And that was worth more than any shelter, any solitude, any safety the mountains could have offered. It was worth everything.